The hearing room was buzzing with the usual noise of papers shuffling, microphones crackling, and the low murmur of side conversations. Jim Jordan leaned into his microphone, voice sharp, shoulders squared, the familiar firebrand swagger radiating. From him, he raised his hand like a gavel and began his tirade, words tumbling fast, laced with accusation and certainty. It was the same performance America had seen from him countless times before. Unrelenting, meant to bulldoze over anyone who dared interrupt. But then, shift. Jasmine Crockett, seated across from him, didn't flinch. She didn't shuffle her notes or lower her eyes. She leaned forward ever so slightly, eyes narrowing, posture steady. The room seemed to pause around her, as though everyone sensed what was about to happen. The bravado pouring from Jordan collided with a wall of unspoken defiance. He tried to cut her off before she had even begun, talking over her as if volume alone could silence substance. A flash of irritation crossed his face, the kind of look a man gives when he's certain authority will carry the day. But Crockett didn't waver. She waited, letting the noise hang in the air, until even his interruptions began to sound hollow. Then, with a calm that cut sharper than any shout, she spoke. "Mr. Jordan," she said, her tone firm yet measured, "if you're finished with theater, perhaps we can talk about the law." The words sliced through the chamber. Silence rippled across the benches, staffers froze mid-scribble, and cameras zoomed in. Crockett wasn't matching his volume. She was dismantling his performance by refusing to play the part he had scripted. For her, the contrast was stunning. His heat met with her ice, his bluster with her clarity. For the first time, Jordan hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed, as if the next line he had prepared no longer fit the moment. Crockett pressed on, each syllable deliberate, her eyes locked on him, ready to dismantle his every word. It was the kind of silence that feels louder than shouting. Silence that says the ground has shifted and everyone in the room knows it. But what happened next left even veteran lawmakers stunned. The clash inside that committee room was more than just another tense exchange on Capitol Hill. By 2025, Americans had grown weary of the shouting matches, the endless sound bites, the politicians who seemed to care more about grandstanding than governing. Hearings weren't just about oversight anymore. They'd become battlegrounds for the nation's soul. Every gavel strike, every exchange, every clip streamed online carried the weight of a bigger question. What kind of country will America choose to be? Jim Jordan had long thrived in this new political theater. His trademark style was speed and volume, rattle off accusations, throw out citations half-remembered, overwhelm his opponent with sheer noise. It was a strategy that worked in the age of 30-second clips and partisan echo chambers. He knew how to play to the cameras, how to ignite his base with a performance that felt less like lawmaking and more like a brawl. For years, that approach had made him untouchable. But in 2025, the ground had shifted. Americans were craving something different. The nation had weathered scandals, investigations, and endless headlines that blurred fact from fiction. People were looking for leaders who could cut through the chaos with clarity, who could rise above the shouting and remind everyone that the law was not a prop, it was the backbone of democracy. That's where Jasmine Crockett came in. She wasn't just another member of Congress fighting for airtime. She carried the credibility of a practiced lawyer, the calm poise of someone who had argued facts in courtrooms, not just in press conferences. Her very presence was a challenge to the Jordan style of politics, a reminder that substance could still outlast noise, that a well-timed fact could silence even the loudest voice. The stakes in that moment weren't small. It wasn't simply about who won a single exchange. This was law versus bluster, preparation versus performance, dignity versus arrogance. For viewers at home, the contrast was electric. One side was trying to dominate by force of personality, the other by the force of truth. And as cameras captured, every second, the outcome mattered far beyond those four walls. Clips like these no longer stayed buried in congressional archives. They erupted across TikTok, X, and YouTube within hours. Memes, headlines, hashtags all were waiting to be born. The instant something unforgettable happened. Every word spoken that day had the potential to echo far beyond Washington. shaping public opinion, inspiring some, enraging others. For Jordan, the risk was humiliation. For Crockett, the opportunity was historic. If she could withstand his storm, if she could expose not just his claims but the hollowness of his entire style, she wouldn't just silence a congressman, she would claim a moment in the national story. A viral moment. A defining clip replayed not just by journalists, but by millions of ordinary Americans hungry for validation, inspiration, and proof that truth still had teeth. That was why the room felt so charged, why every second of their standoff carried the weight of something bigger. Oh, this wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a referendum on how America wanted to be governed by spectacle or by substance. And as the tension thickened, the question loomed: who would seize this moment and define it for history? To understand why this showdown mattered so much, you need to see the players behind the curtain. For years, Jim Jordan had built his reputation on fire rather than facts. He was the man who never wore a jacket, his sleeves rolled up as if he were perpetually ready for a fight. In hearings, he carried himself like a prize fighter and the ring voice raised, hands chopping through the air, never waiting for an opponent to finish before barreling in with his next jab. To his supporters, that style was thrilling, proof that he wasn't afraid to say it like it is. To his critics, it was something else entirely, bluster masquerading as authority. But beneath the fiery delivery, Jordan's command of the law was shaky at best. His opponents had learned to notice the gap citations that didn't check out, precedents invoked that collapsed under scrutiny, arguments stitched together more from conviction than from accuracy. In the courtroom, that kind of carelessness could unravel a case in minutes. In Congress, however, the cameras often rewarded the spectacle. He didn't need airtight reasoning when volume and confidence could carry the day. That habit became his trademark. Jordan leaned on rapid-fire questioning, designed less to seek answers than to overwhelm witnesses. He pressed, he interrupted. He raised his voice until it seemed like he had cornered the truth. But anyone listening closely could hear the cracks. He was less a surgeon with a scalpel and more a brawler swinging wildly in hopes of landing a blow. Over time, colleagues on both sides began to notice the pattern. When Jordan clashed with experts, lawyers, or officials who knew their material, cold, he often faltered. His citations would be exposed as incomplete, his assumptions unraveled. And when pressed for detail, his responses leaned not on clarity, but on sheer force of will, embodied the politics of volume louder, faster, angrier. That arrogance fed into his persona. Jordan treated hearings as stages, not forms of law. He seemed dismissive of procedure, rolling past time limits, snapping at chairs who tried to rein him in. The rules were, to him, obstacles meant for others. He acted as though authority alone entitled him to dominate, as though the microphone was his weapon and his opponents were merely props in his performance. The result was a reputation as a fighter without finesse. In some circles, that made him a hero. Too many Americans, though, it was exhausting a symbol of what politics had become. A man more interested in spectacle than substance, more invested in winning the soundbite than in winning the truth. Yet Jordan never doubted himself. That was his fatal flaw. He believed his volume and presence could silence anyone, no matter how prepared they were. He believed intimidation worked on all opponents. He believed that legal nuance was secondary to political theater. Confidence had carried him this far. Why wouldn't it carry him again? So when he faced Jasmine Crockett in that hearing room, he approached her with the same old playbook. Interruptions. Raised voice. A tone thick with condescension, as if her words could be brushed aside with a sneer. He saw not a lawyer ready to spar with precision, but another opponent to bulldoze. It was a miscalculation born from years of getting away with the same routine. Jordan underestimated not just Crockett's composure, but her training, her ability to dismantle not just a claim, but the very scaffolding of his approach. He underestimated her readiness to turn his style against him, to let his own arrogance set the stage for his undoing. Because while Jordan had grown used to dominating through noise, Crockett had sharpened her skills in silence. While he thrived on volume, she thrived on accuracy. Where he dismissed the law as backdrop, she carried it as her foundation. The contrast was stark. One man wielding arrogance like a weapon. One woman wielding truth like a blade, and that contrast was about to turn the hearing into something unforgettable. But he wasn't prepared for the woman who had been sharpening her legal edge for years. Jasmine Crockett's rise was not the story of privilege or entitlement. It was the story of grit, long before she ever sat in a congressional chamber under the unforgiving glare of cameras. She was a young woman who understood what it meant to work twice as hard just to be heard. Her roots were humble, her path uphill, her resolve shaped by experiences that would have broken a lesser spirit. She had chosen law not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. In a world where marginalized communities, too, often face the blunt end of injustice, Crockett wanted to stand between ordinary people and the machinery of power. She spent her early years in courtrooms representing clients who could barely afford an attorney, watching how the smallest detail of the law could decide whether someone went home to their family or spent years behind bars. She learned quickly that the law, when wielded with skill, could be a shield, but when neglected or abused, it could be a weapon of oppression. The long nights preparing briefs, the countless hours sifting through evidence, the sacrifices of time, energy, and comfort, these were not theoretical exercises for her. They were a survival, both for her clients and for the values she carried. Unlike the politicians who built their careers on headlines and theatrics, Crockett built hers on service. That service gave her not only credibility, but a deep resilience. Forged in the fires of real struggle, she knew what it meant to be underestimated. As a young black woman in the legal field, she had felt the stares, heard the dismissals, endured the insinuations that she didn't belong. But instead of bowing her head, she sharpened her skills. Every doubt cast her way became fuel. Every barrier became a challenge to outthink, outwork, and outlast. She was not simply surviving the system, she was learning to bend it back toward justice. When she stepped into politics, it wasn't out of vanity or ambition for the spotlight. It was because she saw how decisions made in distant chambers rippled outward, shaping the lives of people who had no seat at the table. She carried the courtroom with her into the halls of Congress, bringing the same precision, the same composure, and the same refusal to be intimidated. For Crockett, politics wasn't theater, it was another courtroom, and the American people were her clients. That's why her clashes and hearings carried a different weight. She didn't just debate, she educated. Each time she spoke, it wasn't only to rebut her opponent. It was to lay bare the truth in a way ordinary viewers at home could understand. Her goal was never just to win the room, but to empower the millions outside it, to give them language for what they already felt, that dignity was worth defending, and truth was worth fighting for. Crockett embodied something larger than herself. She became a symbol of a rising generation of American voices women. Immigrants, minorities, working-class fighters who refused to bow to arrogance and condescension. In her, people saw a reflection of their own struggles, their own longing. For leaders who didn't just occupy space but carried the weight of their stories with pride, that authenticity made her dangerous to someone like Jim Jordan. He relied on rattling his opponents, on breaking their rhythm, on making them flinch. But Crockett had spent too many years in real battles to be shaken by theatrics. Her calm wasn't passivity, was strategy. Her patience wasn't weakness, was strength. Every second she held her composure was a reminder that truth does not need to shout to be heard. And so, as the hearing room braced for their collision, the stage was set for more than a clash of personalities. It was the collision of two archetypes. One who had built his brand on arrogance and volume, and one who had built her career on resilience and substance. One who treated law as a prop, and one who treated it as sacred. For those watching, the stakes were bigger than the moment itself. Crockett's presence was proof that dignity could still rise in a system too often choked by ego. Proof that the voices long silenced were now prepared to speak with clarity and conviction. Proof that America, in all its diversity and resilience, was not only watching but ready to demand more. She wasn't just another member of Congress. She was a fighter forged in service. carrying with her the sacrifices of the communities she had defended and the promise of the America she still believed in. Every word she prepared to speak carried that weight. Every glance across the aisle carried that resolve, and when these two finally collided under the bright lights of Congress, history was about to be made. The exchange began, like so many others in Jim Jordan's career, with volume. He thrust a stack of papers into the air, waving them like weapons. His words tumbling over one another in a rapid-fire barrage. He spoke as though speed equaled truth, as though shouting down the clock was the same as proving a point.
Accusation.
Landed heavy with indignation. Each citation rattled off as though no one in the room would dare check its validity. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She sat steady, her hands folded, her gaze fixed. Every interruption, every sideways jab, every exaggerated gesture seemed only to sharpen her resolve. While Jordan's arms chopped at the air, she remained still. Contrast so stark it became its own kind of power. The tension was immediate, electric. Members shifted in their seats. Staffers glanced up from their notes. Some raised eyebrows, some smirked knowingly, as if to say they had seen this performance before. The rhythm was familiar. Jordan, the aggressor, drowning the room with noise, but something about the way Crockett absorbed it made the outcome feel different. Answered the question. Jordan barked, even though he hadn't asked one. His voice echoed against the paneled walls, loud enough to reverberate through the microphones and into millions of homes watching online. He jabbed a finger toward her, punctuating his words. With indignation, Crockett's expression did not change. She blinked once, slowly, her silence lengthening the pause until Jordan's rant began to feel like static. Her refusal to match his volume turned the air heavy, forcing the room to reckon with the contrast. On one side, a storm of noise. On the other, an immovable calm. Murmurs rippled across the chamber. One lawmaker leaned back, shaking his head, while another whispered to a colleague, both barely suppressing a grin. Reporters scribbled faster, sensing the moment swelling toward something headline-worthy. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, lenses trained on Crockett's stillness, anticipating the moment when her composure would break into fire. But it didn't. Jordan raised his stack of papers higher, shaking them dramatically. "It's right here, you're ignoring the facts," shouted, though the very citations he clutched were riddled with holes that only a trained legal eye could spot. To the untrained ear, he sounded forceful. To those who knew better, he sounded desperate, and Crockett knew better. She tilted her head slightly. A small movement, almost imperceptible, but it spoke louder than any rebuttal. It was the look of someone cataloging every error, every falsehood, every empty flourish and waiting for the exact moment to let the truth fall like a hammer. The room buzzed with anticipation. Sidees darted between colleagues, half expecting Crockett to finally snap, to raise her voice, to meet fire with fire. But instead, she let the silence drag, a deliberate counterpoint to his noise. The more he talked, the more his words seemed to pile up against a wall no one else could see. That wall was her patience, and it was unbreakable. Jordan leaned forward, his voice hoarse now, repeating himself, circling the same accusations as if repetition could make them true. His rhythm faltered, the energy of his attack beginning to sag under its own weight. The crowd could feel it, the imbalance, the desperation. Creeping into his tone, what began as dominance now felt like thrashing. And still, Crockett waited. Every eye in the chamber was on her now, waiting for the moment she would strike, waiting for the calm to break into thunder, waiting to see if she would prove that truth. Spoken softly could carry more weight than lies shouted at full volume. The silence around her grew louder than his shouting. It was a silence heavy with anticipation, a silence that turned even his supporters uneasy, a silence that made clear the balance of power was shifting. Then came the moment Crockett unleashed the strike that stopped Jordan in his tracks. For several long seconds, Jasmine Crockett allowed the noise to linger in the air, her silence drawing out every beat until Jim Jordan's voice began to sound less like authority and more like desperation. Then, without raising her tone, she leaned toward the microphone and said the words that sliced the room in two. "Mr. Jordan," she began evenly, "if you're going to quote the law, the least you could do is read it correctly." The chamber froze. The stacked papers in Jordan's hand trembled slightly, his knuckles whitening. He opened his mouth to retort, but Crockett's voice calm, measured, deliberate cut cleanly through his sputtering. You cited Doe v. United States, as though it supports your argument. It doesn't. Not even close. That case was about compelled testimony under immunity. What you're suggesting, completely irrelevant. You didn't just misread it to misrepresented it. Gasps echoed softly from a few rows. Staffers' pens stopped moving. Aides exchanged looks that could only mean one thing. She caught him. Crockett didn't stop. She pressed forward, each line another precise incision. And then you referenced Section 238 again. Wrong. It doesn't apply the way you claim it does. The language you just waved around, hoping nobody would double-check, actually says the opposite. This isn't just sloppy, Congressman. It's reckless. Jordan blinked rapidly, fumbling through his stack, as if the missing truth might appear between the pages. He shuffled one sheet, then another, his mouth opening, then closing, but no words landing with weight. The spectacle of his bluster, collapsing, was almost cinematic. A man known for aggression, suddenly reduced to searching for footing in quicksand. Crockett let the silence grow again, her pause deliberate, her expression unwavering. Then she delivered the dagger. You hold yourself out as some champion of law and order, yet here you are, misquoting cases you clearly don't understand, in a committee meant to uphold justice. The American people deserve honesty, not theatrics. Murmurs rose into audible shock. One congresswoman covered her mouth, trying to conceal a grin. Another leaned back in his chair, smirking openly. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing the headlines were already writing themselves. Jordan tried to interject, "That's not," but Crockett didn't let him finish. She leaned forward once more, her voice still calm, still devastating. You may be used to steamrolling witnesses who don't fight back. But I'm not here to be bullied, Mr. Jordan. I'm here to make sure the truth is on record. Right now, the truth is this. You are misrepresenting the very laws you pretend to defend. The room erupted not with applause, but with that hushed electricity that says everyone present knows they've just witnessed something irreversible. Jordan's mouth twitched, his eyes darting, his usual ferocity slipping into visible frustration. His papers, once a shield, now looked like props stripped of meaning. He flipped through them, trying to salvage a citation, a phrase, a lifeline. None came. Crockett seized the moment. You keep pointing to statutes as if they're magic spells that end debate. But the law isn't about noise. It's about meaning. It's about precedent. It's about justice. And when you get the law wrong as you just did, don't just embarrass yourself. You mislead the American people. That line landed like a gavel strike. Phones buzzed as staffers typed furiously. Clips were already being clipped, tweeted, and shared. Jordan shifted in his chair, clearing his throat, mumbling something about interpretation. But Crockett's patience had run out. Interpretation, she said, her eyebrows arching. There's nothing to interpret when the words are black and white. Unless, of course, you didn't actually read them. The chamber let out an audible "oh," a reaction more fitting for a boxing match than a congressional hearing. And in that moment, it was a boxing match, one where the underdog had just landed a clean, stunning uppercut. Jordan leaned back, his voice smaller now. Well, that's your opinion? It's not an opinion. Crockett shot back instantly, her tone tightening just enough to draw blood. It's the law. And maybe that's the difference between you and me. I actually practice it. I don't just wave it around when the cameras are on. The effect was devastating. Jordan's shoulders slumped, his eyes darting toward his colleagues as though searching for rescue. None came. Around him, the very lawmakers who once nodded along to his bluster now avoided his gaze. The performance was over. The mask cracked. Crockett, meanwhile, sat back, her composure unbroken, her voice steady as ever. The contrast was unmistakable. One figure unraveling, the other ascending. Outside the chamber, Twitter lit up in real time. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Crockett crushes Jordan. Hashtag legal mic drop. Hashtag congressional takedown. Clips of Jordan's fumbling juxtaposed with Crockett's sharp rebukes flooded feeds within minutes. Meme accounts were already overlaying boxing bells and knockout graphics. Commentators called it a masterclass in composure under fire. But inside that room, the silence told the story. Jordan, once the aggressor, was now the defendant in a trial of his own making, his credibility dissolving under Crockett's calm precision. And Crockett, embodying the very steadiness she had cultivated throughout her career, ended with the kind of line that would echo beyond the walls of Congress. People deserve leaders who understand the laws they swear to uphold. If you can't get that right, Mr. Jordan, maybe the problem isn't the law. Maybe the problem is you. It was not shouted. It was not dressed in theatrics. It was delivered with surgical calm, the kind of calm that leaves no room for rebuttal. For a brief moment, no one moved. The silence was total. Jordan blinked, his lips parting, but nothing came out. The man who made a career out of never backing down had been stopped cold-lived in front of the nation, and though the committee would move on, as though other voices would rise and fall, everyone in that room knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. Because this wasn't just about Crockett exposing his ignorance. It was about exposing the hollow core of political bluster itself. And as the cameras kept rolling, as staffers rushed to cut clips, as the public's anticipation swelled to fever pitch, the question loomed over everyone watching. If Jordan could be dismantled so icily here, what would happen when the shockwaves left this chamber? But the true shockwaves came not inside that hearing room, but in what happened afterward. The moment Crockett delivered her final line, the reverberations leapt far beyond the paneled walls of Congress. Within minutes, clips of the exchange began spreading across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. The hashtags surged almost instantly. Hashtag Crockett crushes Jordan. Hashtag legal mic drop, and simply hashtag Jasmine Dash, propelled by a tide of outrage, admiration, and sheer disbelief. By the first hour, the video had already been viewed millions of times. End of the day, it dominated every trending list. People weren't just watching, they were replaying, dissecting, and sharing with captions like, "This is how you handle a bully in law school in 30 seconds. Memes followed, ruthless and unrelenting. Screenshots of Jordan fumbling with his stack of papers became instant fodder. One meme showed him drowning in a sea of legal textbooks, with the caption, "When you didn't do the reading." Another overlaid Crockett's calm stare with the phrase, "Checkmate." On TikTok, users remixed the moment with boxing bells, slow-motion replays, and soundtrack drops that turned the takedown into a cultural event. Meanwhile, praise for Crockett poured in from every corner. Commentators called her performance a masterclass in composure under fire. Legal scholars applauded her precision, noting how effortlessly she exposed the weakness in Jordan's arguments. Progressive voices hailed her as the embodiment of rising leadership in America, fierce, unapologetic, and unafraid to dismantle arrogance with facts. Even late-night comedians joined in. One monologue opened with, "Jim Jordan brought a stack of papers to a hearing. Jasmine Crockett brought the truth. Guess which one held up in court?" The audience roared, and the clip itself went viral. Celebrities amplified the wave. Actors, musicians, athletes, figures with millions of followers shared the video with captions like "Icon" and "This is the future we need" for a generation starved of authentic political voices. Crockett's moment was more than entertainment, it was validation. Jordan, by contrast, found himself on the wrong side of the tidal wave. Conservative allies tried to defend him, but their statements were drowned out by the sheer force of ridicule. His reputation, already shaky outside his base, took a measurable hit. In interviews, journalists pressed him about his fumbling citations, replaying Crockett's words in the background. Each attempt at damage control only seemed to amplify the embarrassment. Inside political circles, whispers grew louder. Analysts pointed out that moments like these often define careers, not just Crockett's, but Jordan's as well. One strategist noted, "He came in swinging and left looking small. That's a hard image to recover from." But for Crockett, the ripple effect was transformative. Overnight, her follower count on social media skyrocketed. Donations to her campaign surged. People wrote messages about feeling seen, represented, inspired. Young women of color in particular called her a role model, someone who could stare down the noise of power and answer with dignity. Cable news replayed the hearing on loop, each outlet putting their own spin on what had unfolded. Progressive hosts hailed it as a breakthrough moment. Even moderate commentators conceded that Crockett had landed a blow Jordan would not soon shake off. The momentum carried into the following days, where the takedown became a symbol of something larger. Editorials framed it as proof that preparation beats bluster, that knowledge still matters in an era of noise, that dignity can still triumph over arrogance. Crockett's rise was cast as not just personal, but generational shift in what Americans wanted from their representatives. Through it all, Jordan's silence spoke volumes. Once the loudest voice in the room, he now seemed diminished, overshadowed by the very calm he had once tried to bulldoze. The ripple effects were undeniable. Crockett elevated to a national figure. Jordan cemented as a cautionary tale, yet behind the memes and headlines lay something deeper. A lesson America desperately needed. As the frenzy of headlines, hashtags, and late-night punchlines began to settle, what lingered wasn't just the image of Jim Jordan fumbling with his papers or JasmineCrockett's.com surgical dismantling of his claims. What lingered was the moral clarity that shone through the chaos. Crockett herself made it clear in interviews that this moment wasn't about one congressman versus one congresswoman. It was about something bigger. This isn't personal, she explained. It's about the responsibility we all carry to respect the truth, to respect the law, to respect the people we represent. And that was the heart of it. What played out in that hearing room was more than a verbal sparring match. It was a living lesson in contrasts. On one side, arrogance, bluster, and ego. On the other, dignity, truth, and service. It was dignity over arrogance. Crockett never once raised her voice, never stooped to insult, never took the bait. She showed that dignity is not weakness, it is strength in its purest form. She proved that the calm voice of reason can silence even the loudest storm. It was truth over bluster. For every misquoted statute, every misrepresented case, every wave of paper meant to distract rather than clarify, Crockett answered with facts. Facts that did not need embellishment. Facts that stood firm even as Jordan's noise collapsed around them. In a time when so much of politics feels like theater, she reminded the nation that truth still matters, and it was service over ego. Jordan's performance was about himself, his anger, his volume, his brand. Crockett's presence was about something greater, the people who entrusted her with their voice. She carried their struggles, their hopes, their demand for justice into that chamber. Every line she spoke was anchored not in self-promotion, but in service. The message resonated far beyond Washington. Across America, viewers saw themselves in Crockett's steadiness. Immigrants who had been told to stay quiet, women who had been talked over in boardrooms, young people who had been dismissed as naive, saw a reflection of their own battles in her calm, refusal to be silenced. Her victory in that moment wasn't just rhetorical. It was symbolic. It reminded the nation that power does not belong to the loudest voice, but to the truest one. It reminded us that justice is not a performance, but a practice. It reminded us that resilience, steady, patient, unflinching will, always outlasts bluster. As one commentator put it, Crockett didn't just win an argument. She reminded America what leadership looks like. That is why this moment will echo. Because in a time of division, when arrogance so often drowns out humility, when ego so often replaces service, Crockett's stand was more than political theater. It was a call back to core values. America is watching, and America is learning. In the weeks that followed, her words continued to circulate. Not as a fleeting viral clip, but as an emblem of something enduring. Dignity, truth, service. These weren't just her tools, they became her legacy. And as the cameras faded and the memes gave way to memory, one image remained, JasmineCrockett.com and steady under fire, standing as proof that resilience, law, and justice still have champions in the halls of power. History, after all, remembers more than noise. It remembers the voices that rise above it. Jim Jordan came into that hearing room armed with noise, with bluster, with the same old performance he had repeated for years. But this time was different. This time he met Jasmine Crockett, a voice, sharpened by truth, grounded in law, and unshakable in dignity. And in that collision, arrogance was silenced. That's why the title of this story rings so true. Jim Jordan silenced by Jasmine Crockett, because it wasn't just about one exchange, one rebuttal, or one viral clip. It was about a truth that could no longer be shouted down. Crockett's calm dismantling of Jordan's false citations reminded the nation that facts still matter, that law still matters, that leadership is not measured by volume, but by integrity. In her silence, she showed power. In her precision, she showed strength. And in her words, she showed that dignity always cuts deeper than arrogance. Moments like this are rare, but when they come, they remind us of what's possible. They remind us that service can still triumph over ego, and that justice can still find its voice in the halls of power. So here's the call. If this moment gave you hope, if it made you believe, even for a moment, that dignity can stand tall against arrogance, don't let it fade. Share it. Talk about it. Be part of the movement that insists on truth, that demands respect, that refuses to be silenced. Because history is shaped not only by what happens in those hearing rooms, but by how we carry those lessons forward. Jasmine Crockett showed us what resilience looks like. Now it's up to us to make sure that resilience becomes the standard, not the exception.